Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for professional speaking. We have Bob Miller with us this morning. He was born and raised in Fort Worth, Texas, and is a graduate from the School of Veterinary Medicine at Texas A&M. He later received his Master's of Public Health from the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston. He's practiced veterinary medicine for 3 years and then pursued his career in regulatory veterinary medicine with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Animal Health Division. He's worked with several different agencies before retiring in 2000, and after retiring, he moved to Botetourt and worked as a consultant in the field of veterinarian biologics development and manufacturer. In 2008, he met Sherry Krantz, and they've lived happily ever after, and he has been with us at Brandon Oaks for a year. We will be taking calls and questions at the end, and that number to call is 397-2912. Bob?
Thank you. I invited a few close friends to come to laugh at my jokes today, and also to wave their hands if they don't understand something, or to yawn real big if I'm putting them to sleep. I made the decision to become a veterinarian very early in my life. I was about 8 years old, and I was intent that I was going to put a practitioner that didn't respond to my call when my dog died. I was going to put him out of business, and of course, by the time I graduated, he had already retired, so that goal was finished. During my veterinary career, we did have a pretty good course on veterinary public health, which dealt primarily with zoonotic diseases and some epidemiology. And between my third and fourth years in vet school, I worked for USDA in their animal health programs in a brucellosis eradication program in cattle. I practiced for 3 years, and pretty soon the glamour of practice wore off on me. I decided to take a couple of years off, and if I could get a job doing what I was doing as a student trainee at a much better pay because I had the DVM degree. But you can get all of that stuff you want on television. There's the amazing Dr. Pohl and Dr. Jeff, Rocky Mountain Vet, and Pet Vets, the Dream Team, and there's veterinary shows all over veterinary practices that show you the glamorous side of it and not the downsides that I encountered. So I applied for a job in USDA, and I went to Alabama to work in the brucellosis and tuberculosis eradication programs. The brucellosis program went out to herds. Back up just a little bit. Federal law required that the states have a brucellosis eradication program, and as states became certified brucellosis free, they put restrictions on the states that did not reach that goal. Alabama was in the final stages of trying to reach that goal when I went to work there in 1965. My work consisted primarily of contacting cattle owners, scheduling a test for their cattle, going out and collecting blood samples. At that time, we mailed them off to Auburn, and a few days later, we got the results back, and if a cow reacted to that test, we would go out, put a brand owner, we'd quarantine the herd. The owner was required to sell that animal for slaughter only, and then we'd come back in 30 to 60 days, retest again until we had 2 clean tests of the herd. This worked pretty well. The rate of infection was not too bad. I was working in what's called the Black Belt of Alabama, which is a big agricultural area, and these were the states with the most, or the counties in that area that had the most cattle to be tested. Wasn't too hard. There ran into some problems. The owners were supposed to restrain their cattle for us to take the blood sample. We collected it by puncturing the jugular vein in the neck because it's a nice big vein and should be easy to hit. The one real problem I had one time, I went out and these farmers pretty rural. They had their one old cow tied to a fence post, and I didn't have anybody to help me, and they were about as old as I am now. This was 50 years ago. And so I decided, well, I can test this cow. She's small, you know, she had this nice curly set of horns. And so I bent down, and she was pulling back on the fence post, and I got the jugular vein exposed real well. And the minute I struck her with it, she jumped back and caught her horn behind my ear. And the next thing I knew, I was bleeding from my ear, and that scared me a bit. I went ahead and got the blood sample, though. And so they brought me some water to clean myself up, to get the blood off my face and all this, and I was washing it, and I said, where does this come from? He said, well, it comes from the springs where the cows get their water. So when I got home, I went to the local practitioner, and he sewed my ear up, or the medical doctor, not the local veterinarian. But he put this big compress on it, and I had to go to a meeting of the Marengo County Livestock Owners Association that night. It's kind of embarrassing, but in the tuberculosis test, you had to inject a small amount of tuberculin in the fold of the skin right behind to the side of the tail of the animal, and these were only dairy cows that you were doing, so you were walking down this milking barn just injecting these cows, and let me tell you, Holstein cows carry a pretty good kick. At the time I thought Bear Bryant ought to come down and recruit a couple of them to kick his field goals for him. Then you had to go back 72 hours later, that's 3 days, and read the test. And here again, if they had a reactor, they had to be sold for slaughter only. The owner was compensated for the loss of price that he would have gotten as selling it as a regular slaughter animal, but because it had the brand on the jaw that we put on them, the price was knocked down. So that was a big program. Also had to collect blood from a few swine herds. They were testing for swine brucellosis as well as bovine brucellosis. Brucellosis, by the way, causes undulant fever in people, and bovine tuberculosis can be transmitted to man. These were both public health programs. And at the same time, they were carrying out a hog cholera eradication program because it's very financially damaging disease. After I left Alabama, I went on a training program to familiarize myself with all of the various programs in the Animal Health Division at that time, which included import of animals and products at the ports, and various field programs out in the field. Even went to a school to teach me how to use a Geiger counter in case we were ever attacked by the Soviet Union with their nuclear bombs. And we had, I don't know what I was supposed to do with it, but I carried a Geiger counter around with me for a few years. And basically finished that program up, went back to my home state, and the guy that was in charge of the program for the federal government at that time had retired and taken my spot on the employee roster, so I really didn't have much to do. But we did have a new program of animal welfare, which was intended to stop the cruelty of animals, particularly dogs and cats that were used in research, and other animals, particularly the procurement of them, how they were handled and treated before they got into the research. And the research was supposed to be, humane with whatever they did with them. And I worked at that for about a year, and at that time in the government service, they could reassign you quite easily. But one day I got a call from a higher up that I knew, and he said, well, congratulations on your promotion. And I said, well, gee, thank you. And I thought I'd be put as an assistant in charge of some state's field programs, but no, they took me into the staff offices inside the Beltway in the Washington, D.C. area and put me in the animal products import staff. And that is probably the worst job you could put a veterinarian into in government. And apparently nobody else wanted it because they picked me to go into it. Very unsatisfactory working conditions. At that time, the plant side was taking over most of the port inspection on animal products, so we're having to liaise with those people as well as the people in veterinary medicine who were establishing the rules and regulations for bringing it in, and we had to answer letters from the public who wrote letters into us, can I bring in sausage from Italy? And we had to say no. And I tried all kinds of letters, and in dealing with the plant side, they had typewriters that had paragraphs that, stock paragraphs that you put in, and I went to my supervisor and said, we ought to get some of these, and he said, no, we write personal letters, we don't write form letters. But he insisted that every letter start out with certain laws, rules, and regulations administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture are designed to prevent the introduction of foreign animal diseases into the United States. Now, that could have been put on a tape and typed up, but anyhow, concurrently with my assignment there, they were forming a new unit in the animal health side that was designed to work with emergency diseases. This was the time that the Venezuelan equine encephalitis was moving into the United States, and it was a good time for reorganization of what was going on, so they started filling these positions, and again, it was not a competitive thing. They picked who they wanted in slots. And when the organization got filled up, there was one slot that nobody wanted, and it was called remote sensing. They had been contacted by a colleague in NASA in Houston that was working with human health side problems with remote sensing. This is satellite imaging and photography from aircraft. So I called the boss of that group and I said, if you haven't got anybody else in that job, I'd sure like to have it. I didn't tell him because I didn't like the job I was in. But he said, oh, great, come on over. And so basically I was detailed to the Houston Johnson Space Center in Houston, or actually in Nassau Bay, Texas, to work on that. And before I moved down there, I went to a meeting and met a U.S. Air Force physician who said, they've got a new School of Public Health up in Houston. You ought to go get you an MPH while you're down here doing that. So I suggested that to the boss, and he said, we cannot send you to school to get a degree. However, we can send you to school to take courses that will help you in your evaluation of this technology for application in our animal disease, emergency animal disease programs. So I did that. I was there for just about a year. And unfortunately, at the end of the year, I could not justify us using the technology that was available in 1973 for our programs because computer time was tremendously expensive. Any photography or satellite imagery that was available to us had a 2-week delay by the Department of Defense to make sure it wouldn't work right. And with emergency programs, you need to respond quickly. So I had to say, boss, I don't think this is going to work for us, but I did get the MPH while I was there. Went back up to Hyattsville, Maryland, to the staff position, and they had a position that was vacant but reserved for a person that was in a foreign assignment, and this was in our international program staff. Probably one of the most interesting programs. We had cooperative programs with all of the countries of North and Central America and in Colombia to prevent the introduction of foot and mouth disease. And at that time, there was interest in completing the Pan American Highway from Panama City down to Bogota, Colombia. And Colombia was infected with foot and mouth disease, and none of the Central American countries were. So we were having to work in that program to find ways that we could allow completion of that highway and then still protect the countries. So took a lot of negotiations and worked real good. It was really a fascinating experience because we'd have people from Mexico, Central America, come to our offices for visits. One time I took a bunch of them down to the Capitol at night, and the House of Representatives was in session. And we asked the lady at the desk if we could go in, and they all had their foreign passports with them, said, yes, you can go in, but this guy can't go in because he's a U.S. citizen and he's got to get something from his representative to go in there. They said, oh, but ma'am, he's our interpreter. And she said, oh, okay, go in. So I did get to see the House sitting in session one night. At the end of the 2 years, though, the individual that had that slot came back. I had, in the training program that I'd been to South Texas to McAllen and Mission, where they were raising screwworm flies. And back in about 6 months earlier, they had advertised a position for an epidemiologist there. And I thought, well, with my background in Masters of Public Health, with a lot of stress on epidemiology, and my little bit of experience in international programs with Mexico and the Central American states, it'd be good. And we had some real family problems back in Texas at that time. So I put in for that job, and I got it. I mean, they had re-advertised it before I put in for it, so nobody obviously wanted it. And so I went down to take part in that program. Now, screwworm flies lay eggs that the larvae require living flesh to complete their life cycle. And after the eggs hatch, the larvae bore into the wound on the eggs are laid on a wound in a warm-blooded animal. And after the larvae hatch, they burrow into the flesh. And they have spikes on them, which makes them very hard to get out. And the little rings, they look like screws, so they call them screwworms. And couple of USDA scientists, Bushland and Knipling, back in the late 30s, realized that this fly was very low density, and that by irradiating the pupa, they could sterilize the flies without killing them. And if you had enough sterile flies to overwhelm the population of native screwworm flies, you could eradicate the disease. The first screwworm eradication happened on Sanibel Island off the coast of Florida. Unfortunately, it's very close to the coast, and it got reinfested. And World War II came along, and all this kind of research was just put aside. Later on, they went down to Curacao in the Netherlands, Antilles, and eradicated screwworms there, and it was far enough off the coast of Venezuela that it did not get reinfected. So they carried out a program of eradication in Florida. And then in 1962, the year that I graduated from veterinary school, they started up a program in South Texas. So then here it is about 15 years later that I go down to be the epidemiologist in charge of fly distribution. Things went pretty well, except it was almost the worst year they'd ever had by 1977 when we were down there. Actually had a human case of screwworms in San Antonio, and the lady died from the infestation. But the entomologist finally discovered that the flies, the way we raised those flies, I didn't have anything to do with raising them, thank goodness, was that we raised them in a facility that was very high security, but after the pupa of the fly emerged as adult flies, they were flying around and breaking off their wings, and they couldn't mate without their wings, and so they kept them in the dark. And this strain of flies had been there for about 10 years, and they were blind. They had evolved a species of blind fly because the flies were only in the dark. So they went out and captured some new flies for seed stock, replaced the strain that we were using, and miraculously cases dropped and dropped and dropped. Oh, my job there was basically from the time we got the sterile pupa in, I supervised the emergence of these pupa into flies and the packaging of the pupa and the distribution of them in the aircraft. I actually supervised the pilots. The chief pilot was very irate about this. He didn't like reporting to a veterinarian, thought he ought to report at least to the boss of the facility. And one day I came in and they were all crowded into our radio room, and what's the problem? They said, well, so-and-so can't get his speed up. And they were taking him through all kinds of manifold, these were prop planes, World War II and previously planes. And they couldn't figure out what was wrong. The chief pilot was there, the chief mechanic was there, and they were doing all this stuff. I just said, well, let him get his gear up. And they asked him, and of course he hadn't. And so then I turned to the chief pilot and I said, now you know why you're answering to a veterinarian to solve your problems. That was one of my few victories there. But we did eventually eradicate the screwworm fly and pushed it down into Mexico to where the Mexico program took over. I was acting director of the program and mission at the time that we made the decision to kill our colony, and that was the handwriting on the wall that I had to go somewhere. I applied for a couple of positions back in the staff area. One of them was in the brucellosis eradication program, which I had some familiarity with, and the other was in the veterinary biologics program. Now, the selecting officer was an old Texas boy and had a worse accent than I do. And he called me up on the phone one day and said, Bob, you're qualified for both of these jobs on the certificate. I said, well, Milt, I'd like to take the brucellosis job because I know something about that. And he said, well, Bob, you're the only one on the certificate for the veterinary biologics staff, and if you can take that one, then I can fill two positions. And new president was coming in, and everybody was afraid that all transfers would be frozen. So I said, okay. That's probably one of the best decisions I made career-wise because I was back working with animal diseases and ways to prevent it. We worked under the Virus Serum Toxin Act of 1909, I think it was, and basically our commission was to provide rules and regulations that would assure that the veterinary biologics were pure, safe, potent, and effective. And I went back and took a couple of college courses just to catch up with what I had missed in the 20 years preceding that. And there were a lot of educational opportunities in veterinary biologics for scientists in that area. The National Institutes of Health had seminar courses and weekly seminars that provided all sorts of scientific information. As we progressed, we got into recombinant DNA vaccines. The first ones that came in were inactivated viruses, and so those pretty much were pro forma that to most of our regulations. But then the new one came in, the company that I was regulating, and it was for a live recombinant virus vaccine to be used in wildlife, which presented a whole bunch of new problems. And it was determined that we needed to make an environmental assessment before we approved any studies with this virus outside of contained laboratories. It was quite a political thing. There were certain people whose jobs depended upon them debunking anything that the government did that gave us a lot of grief during that process. We had review panels, public hearings, and eventually it was approved to do a field test of it out in Wachapreague Island in Virginia. And we carried out that test, and there was no proven escape of the virus. It seemed to be safe. It was for raccoons to prevent rabies. And so then we went further. Our regulations required that to license a vaccine, you had to prove it effective with a challenge study in animals. So the company dead by a bunch of raccoons. You vaccinate some, you leave some unvaccinated, keep them together for a year, and then challenge them. And in that challenge study, it wasn't as good as you would want to see, but it was very effective. It was like 80% effective. And so we went ahead and licensed it. So that was one of the big things I did in my veterinary biologics career. Along about the time that got finished up, my wife died, and they decided to move our staff out to Ames, Iowa, where our field operations offices were and where the laboratories that tested these products were. So I took the opportunity to get out of the Washington area and moved out to Ames to set up the new staff. That lasted for a little over a year, and then when a new director of veterinary biologics was chosen, I trained him to do the job that I knew, and then it became apparent that I should retire. And as Treva said, I moved to Botetourt County and did some consulting work, particularly with the firm that did this rabies study. And the staff in Ames ultimately made some decisions that I would have never made, but that's progress, I'm sure. So I quit consulting for anybody because I didn't figure I could give them an honest appraisal. So in conclusion, I'll just say, and Sherry, don't take this wrong, but the best jobs I had, the most rewarding jobs I ever had, were jobs that nobody else wanted. So thank you. If you have any questions, call 397-2912. And the person that has that number is not in the room, so I don't know if you'll get to me. Do any of you have questions? I did invite a few folks here today. No questions? Yes.
I'm curious, is there a relationship between the studies that you do, not you personally, but the government does with animals, and the studies that are done with humans? Do y'all know why I'm asking that question?
Yes. As I said earlier, our studies all involve active challenges that have to produce disease in the animals. You cannot do that with humans. We have the same principles of purity, safety, potency, and efficacy. One of the reasons this law was passed was that they were importing calves from Japan to make smallpox vaccine for human use up in New York, and the smallpox vaccine was co-infected with the foot and mouth disease virus. That was one of the last foot and mouth disease virus outbreaks in the United States. And that's where our laws started coming from. Another little side thing is that in 1965, we started working on the brucellosis eradication program and the tuberculosis. These programs have been going on long before I joined, but there are still cases of brucellosis and tuberculosis in Texas and Wisconsin. So it's kind of an ongoing process. No further questions? Okay, well, we'll close this down then.